So welcome everybody to our second CUSAP talk of the Lent term. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Paul Offit. Dr. Offit is of course the director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and the Professor of Vaccinology at the University of Pennsylvania, an internationally recognized expert in virology and immunology with over 150 published papers, and of course the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, RotaTeq. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul Offit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I was just going to speak for like maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then just open it up to your questions. The issue I think I was asked to address was pseudoscience, and because the topic of the day is this pandemic, which you probably all read about, I thought I would address that. So enter the anti-vax crowd. I mean, you have a big anti-vax crowd in England. I mean, Andrew Wakefield is the one who sort of started the whole notion that vaccines can cause autism with his publication in The Lancet that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine caused autism. And then you shipped him to the United States. Yeah, thanks for that. Really appreciate it. I mean, first it's the T tax, and now Andrew Wakefield. It's enough already. But so where the anti-vaccine people come in is they're conspiracy theorists, and they are expert pseudoscientists, and they. So here's what they're saying. So we'll go through sort of the pseudoscience that they put forward. The first and the most obvious is that masks cause SARS-CoV-2 infections. Another is that the SARS vaccines cause SARS-CoV-2 infections. My favorite is that the mRNA vaccines. So the mRNA vaccines are genetic vaccines, right? It's a small piece of messenger RNA that's contained in a lipid nanoparticle. It's the Pfizer vaccine, it's the Moderna vaccine, taken up into cells. The mRNA enters the cytoplasm, enters the ribosomal system where it's translated to a protein, in this case, the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, which is then either put on the cell or excreted and induces antibodies against SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. They're thinking, and it was predictable, was that because it's a genetic vaccine, it will alter your genes, right? It's going to alter your DNA. And here's why that's not possible. First of all, it's mRNA. It sits in the cytoplasm. In order to enter the nucleus, which is where DNA resides, it would need to have a nuclear access signal, which it doesn't have. So mRNA can't enter the nucleus. Two, even if it entered the nucleus, which it can't, it's RNA. It's not DNA. So it needs to be reverse transcribed to DNA, which requires reverse transcriptase, an enzyme that the vaccine also doesn't have. So even if it entered the nucleus, which it can't, or it was reverse transcribed to DNA, which it doesn't have the enzyme to do, even if that all happened, it has to be integrated into your DNA, which requires the enzyme integrase, which it also doesn't have. So it's impossible for that to happen. I mean, you have a better chance of becoming Spider-Man after you get an mRNA vaccine than actually of having it alter your DNA. Although technically, just to stick to the science, you become Spider-Man when you're bitten by a radioactive spider. Okay, so I don't want to leave the science here. The other thing that they've argued is that the flu vaccine can cause SARS-CoV-2. And that Bill Gates is behind the whole SARS-CoV-2 thing, that Bill Gates is the one who engineered this virus coming out of Wuhan, that apparently $60 billion was not enough money for Bill Gates, that by engineering this virus, that way he can sort of make money on vaccines, which enables him to be richer. Or that my personal favorite, that the vaccines contain microchips, which then, when injected into your body, allows you to be followed. By the way, a microchip would not fit through that little needle at the end of a syringe, but in any case. So there's a movie that's called Plandemic, which is made by the anti-vaccine people. 8 million people viewed that vaccine within the first week. It's incredibly powerful, and it's this notion of conspiracy. It's just really easy to appeal to the notion of conspiracy. we now have a congresswoman from the 14th district in Georgia who was elected to Congress. She ran against a Republican. She ran against another Republican in the primary who's a neurosurgeon who grew up in suburban or in rural Georgia, went to Johns Hopkins, met his wife who's an anesthesiologist. They came back. Okay, she beat him out. She beats out the neurosurgeon. She believes that among other things, that the Jewish people created lasers from space that they then sent down to create wildfires in California. This is her belief. Okay, so they went. Somebody from the Daily Beast the other day went around and asked people in Congress, "Do you think Jewish people created lasers that they then from space, sent down to create wildfires in California?" Okay, this is not a hard question actually to be asked if you're in Congress. So people like Steve Scalise and Liz Cheney said no. But Gohmert, who's from Dallas, said he refused to comment on that he couldn't say yes or no. And 5 Republican congressmen refused to answer that question. It's just, we're living in an age of conspiracy. I think Donald Trump was largely elected based on his conspiracy theories. And so it's just that prominent. So it's hard. I mean, it's hard out there. But in any case, that's just my general sort of rant for a few minutes about conspiracy theories regarding this vaccine. And why don't I just answer your questions? Let me just answer any question. You can ask me any question you want about anything.
Well, while we wait for some questions from our wonderful members of the call,
let's see some face. Were you guys all on a witness protection program? Come on.
I have some questions, just to get the ball rolling. So, as head of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, how do you think we can best approach educating the public regarding vaccines? Or do you not think it is a matter of education? Is this more of a matter of ideology, or perhaps rejection of education and intellectualism? How would you approach this?
I think I'm no doubt naive about this, but I do think that, well, you can divide the people who, let's say, are skeptical about vaccines into 2 groups. I think one are a group I would call vaccine skeptics, which is fair. I think you should be skeptical of anything you put into your body, including vaccines. I mean, there was a survey done in October of 2020 asking the question, would you get a COVID-19 vaccine? Well, in October of 2020, that question was, would you get a theoretical COVID-19 vaccine? Because there wasn't a COVID-19 vaccine. If you asked me that question, I would say no, not until I see the data. I would consider myself a vaccine skeptic. I'm on the FDA, Food and Drug Administration's Vaccine Advisory Committee. I can tell you that 15 people that sit around that table are all vaccine skeptics. Show me the data. So I think that's fair. And I think people, when they call me, which is often, have specific questions about the vaccine that they're nervous about. Fair enough. The vaccine was made in a year. The language that surrounded the development of that vaccine in this country was a little scary, right? Operation Warp Speed, race to a vaccine, who's going to be the first to cross the finish line. The technology that's being used to make the 2 vaccines in our country are novel technologies. I mean, there is no messenger RNA vaccine. Same thing in England. I mean, the AstraZeneca UK vaccine, that replication defective simian adenovirus, does not have a commercial counterpart. So these are novel vaccine strategies to combat a difficult virus, an elusive virus that's already had a number of clinical and pathological surprises. I think it's fair to be skeptical about this vaccine. But I think when you look at the data, and you can I think educate people about the things that they're concerned about, I think most people are convinced, and that's what's happened. I mean, the answer to the question, would you get a COVID-19 vaccine, has gotten better and better. It's gone from like 40% now to about 70%. There are certain groups that continue to say they definitely would not get a vaccine. African Americans in this country are less likely to get a vaccine. 14% say they would definitely not get a vaccine. Republicans are definitely in that category. 25% of Republicans say they would definitely not get a vaccine. Only 5% of Democrats answer the question that way, because it's this whole Trump cult of denialism thing, which is we just close our eyes and pretend this doesn't exist. On the other hand, there are what I would call vaccine cynics. I mean, these are the anti-vaccine activists. They're conspiracy theorists. There is no talking them out of it. Or as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, if someone reaches a conclusion without using logic or reason is not going to talk them out of it. So forget it. I mean, when people call me and it's clear that they know more than I do, that they're just telling me things I don't know, that they see me as all part of the conspiracy, I say to them, is there anything I can tell you that's going to change your mind? If the answer is no, why are we having this conversation? So I bail. But I do think if you look at the autism story, thank you again for sending us Andrew Wakefield with his MMR causes autism story. But he's in Austin, Texas now. He's keeping Austin weird. But he was wrong. I mean, he published a paper in the Lancet in 1998 claiming that MMR caused autism. It was just a case series. It wasn't a study at all. But, now there's 18 studies showing that if you look at people who did or didn't get MMR vaccine, the incidence of autism is the same in both groups. If you asked 15 years ago when that paper was published, if you asked the question, do you think that the MMR vaccine causes autism among parents of children with autism, I think 90% would have said yes. Today, the recent study by the Autism Science Foundation showed that's about 15%. So that's way down, which is to say, eventually, I do think science does win out. I do. I mean, it's the Galileo line, right? I mean, when he was sort of brought before the tribunal, when he dared to say that, that the earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around, that contrary to the Bible, that the earth wasn't the center of the firmament. While he was being carried out in chains, he said, presumably in Italian, referring to the earth, it still moves. I mean, you can deny it all you want, but the fact of the matter is the earth does revolve around the sun, and eventually this became obvious. And I think that's true in science too. I think scientific truths ultimately do win out.
Thank you very much. I think Mr. Lewis has a question, if you'd like to ask it.
Oh, yeah. It's perhaps a bit difficult to phrase, I suppose, but I think it's pretty clear that a lot of misinformation does proliferate and, spread particularly on social media and the internet. And it just seems, I don't have any data to back this up clearly, but it seems like a lot of the people who, when we were children, when we were growing up, would say, oh, don't believe things you read on the internet, don't believe everything you read. It seems like a large proportion of that same crowd are now part of the group which does believe a lot of the stuff that ends up getting forwarded and shared on social media. And it could be completely different people, but I'm just wondering if you think perhaps there's been, what could be the reason for that shift in attitudes towards information that's been shared on the internet, or has there been one at all? Is this completely different group of people, or is it the same group of people who've, for whatever reason, somehow just completely changed their mind about reading stuff?
So I think sort of we've seen in this country kind of the natural evolution of an anti-vaccine movement. I think if you looked at when Andrew Wakefield, after he published that paper and came to the United States, he was a darling. I mean, he was on morning and evening news programs. He was on 60 Minutes. He testified in front of Congress. He was embraced by the media. I mean, attractive, well-spoken, with a British accent, right? I mean, here in the United States, we're all willing to sort of give ourselves back to the Queen at this point, I think. We love that British accent. So he was very influential. And then over time, he was wrong. I mean, study after study showed he was wrong. 18 studies done on 7 different continents or 3 different continents in 7 different countries, spending tens of billions of dollars, showed he was wrong. And so what happened was, you saw that basically the mainstream media, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the morning and evening news programs, all generally abandoned Andrew Wakefield. And in part, I know this is going to sound odd, and I'm going to get to your question about the internet, but the Andrew Wakefield was good for science. He was good for science because not only was he wrong, he was fraudulent and wrong. I mean, he misrepresented both clinical and biological data in his study of 12 children, 8 of whom had autism. He had a patent on a safer, quote unquote, safer measles vaccine. He received the equivalent of several £100,000 to basically launder legal claims through a medical journal, as 5 of those 8 parents were in the midst of suing pharmaceutical companies. Nobody likes a fraud. And that was he. He was not just wrong, he was fraudulent and wrong. So he became more and more marginalized. And I think when the anti-vaccine group hooked themselves to his star, and his star came falling, they fell with him. And so they lost mainstream media attention. I mean, Andrew Wakefield's last hurrah on the national stage in this country, was on Anderson Cooper 360, which is a CNN program, where basically Anderson Cooper just tore into him. So this group, the anti-vaccine group, has gotten more and more marginalized. They've lost attention from the mainstream media, so they have gone to the internet. This is now where they are. It's the same people. It's the same, Barbara Fisher, J.B. Hanley. They are now all on the internet. And what's happened is, because they proffer misinformation on the internet, and because that misinformation can cause harm, they're starting to lose their foothold on the internet. I mean, groups like Pinterest and Google and Facebook and YouTube and others are trying to now really crack down on that. Recently, the anti-vaccine movement group sort of attacked a line of people who were waiting to get SARS-CoV-2 vaccines in Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles. And that got a lot of play. And apparently there was one Facebook site that they had all sort of gone to rally here. And that now is being looked at to be taken down. So I think as you get marginalized, you get meaner and louder, and you jump up and down and scream more. And that is them on the internet. They've gotten sort of more crazy, actually, because I guess that's what you do when you're marginalized. You say even more crazy stuff. So I think that's good. I mean, I think but you're never going to eliminate it, because I just talked to a woman this morning who was an anti-vaccine activist, and now she's the opposite of that. And she just had this sort of mea culpa Zoom call with me this morning. But what motivated her was fear. It's just very easy to appeal to people's sense of fear about getting these. It's hard. I mean, in this country, we ask parents of children in the first few years of life to get vaccines to prevent 14 different diseases. That can mean as many as 27 inoculations in the first few years of life. It can mean as many as 5 shots at one time to prevent diseases most people don't see, using biological fluids most people don't understand. It's very easy to appeal to a sense of fear. Tell me I shouldn't do this. Give me a way out of having to do this. And that's what these anti-vaccine activists on the internet provide. But I think that we're winning this battle, because I naively believe the truth ultimately does win.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just build on a thing you said at the beginning, which was about TV? And so I was reading your book, Killing Us Softly, which is an amazing book on alternative medicine. And you talk a lot about how celebrities and celebrity TV shows in particular have led to the rise of sort of like famous, but clearly fraudulent people, like, say, Dr. Oz, Jenny McCarthy, and Suzanne Somers, and so on. Do you think that same kind of celebrity television has had an impact on vaccine hesitancy that we see now?
Yeah, I mean, I think people trust actors and actresses. I think they see them on the big screen or little screen in movies or on television, and they think they know them. I mean, Jim Carrey is one example of that. I mean, his roles in movies is he's funny, he's nice, he's sort of an everyman, and so that's attractive. And you assume then that he is that person, even though he's not. I mean, he sort of wrote something on the Huffington Post about me that was so incredibly vicious. So he's not a nice guy. I just want to say, Jim Carrey. But people assume that he is that person, and so yeah, he does have influence. I mean, Mehmet Oz has kind of come around a little bit. He's being paid by Walgreens basically to sort of front for the flu vaccine, so he's now much more pro-vaccine than he used to be. But he's an alternative medicine hero to people. He has a show called the Dr. Oz Show here, and he just asked me to be on that last week. It's kind of like it's like the National Enquirer version of the journal Science. That's what the Doctors is, and it's just hard to go on that show, but they just try. And there's another show called The Doctors, which I was on. It was the same thing. I mean, it's just painful to listen to the way they ask the questions. You have to really, really dumb down your answers, to realize who you're talking to. But no, I think it does. I think that celebrities are used to sell products for that reason. I mean, there's not any reason that celebrities necessarily know anything about pistachio peanuts, but there they are selling them on television. So, and that's what you're up against. I mean, scientists rarely are asked to endorse products, like peanuts or Jell-O or anything, because, we're basically unattractive and boring. That's my theory about that. I mean, not you guys, but, here in the US, they're unattractive and boring.
Of course.
Thank you.
I believe we next have a question from Christopher Check. If you'd like to say yourself, Chris.
Thank you. Great question, Maurice. And very interesting. You talked about the marginalized earlier. We had a few speakers on the psychology and behavioral science of conspiracy theory earlier last term. My question is, so Dr. Offit, you teach a lot of medical students and scientific students, and you have a lot of engagements with the academic community. And there is and as you mentioned earlier, there's some sort of loss of appeal about the scientific community, and a kind of break between the messaging from experts with some communities, particularly if they are deeply vested in echo chambers. I was wondering whether you felt that there was anything that the academic community was getting wrong, and what advice you might have for students and medics and budding science communicators like us on going forwards and trying to, on a mission to further the method of scientific or logical thought, rational thought in the world?
No, Doug, that's a great question. Here's my advice. My advice is get in the game. You think that when you see anything that is where science or medicine is misrepresented, and therefore causes people to get bad information, with which they will then no doubt make bad decisions. Get in the game. I mean, make the phone call, call the person who wrote the article, call the editor who edited the article. I mean, call the producer on the television station that did. That's how really I got started. I mean, I spent 26 years working to create the strains that became the bovine human reassortant rotavirus vaccine, RotaTeq. I mean, I spent most of my life in a concrete blocked windowless room inoculating mice. I mean, that wasn't training for going on the Colbert Report, which I eventually was on twice. I mean, but I got angry actually because I had sort of we took our vaccine from bench to bedside. I mean, I had a pretty good idea of just how hard it was to make a vaccine and prove that it was what you claimed it to be. And then you watch the paper by Andrew Wakefield, which is this flimsy, wrong kind of, just case series that makes a series of claims, about MMR vaccine, that because you're giving it as a combination that weakens the immune system because the immune system's weak, that the measles vaccine virus goes to the intestinal surfaces and damages the intestine, that because the intestine is damaged, that allows for the ingress of encephalopathic or brain damaging proteins to go to the brain, cross an intact blood-brain barrier, and cause autism, for which he had not a shred of evidence. And for not any part of that hypothesis did he have a shred of evidence. And so you watch that, and then you see nobody say anything. I mean, it just really upsets me because I work in a hospital where there's not a year that goes by where we don't see a child get admitted with a vaccine preventable disease because the parent made a decision based on bad information that caused the child to suffer and occasionally die. And I think what I saw was that I thought there were people that were doing that, that were sort of standing up there, people that were scientists. I mean, the pediatricians would invariably get on TV and say, look, I vaccinate my own children, vaccines are good, vaccine preventable disease are bad. But I didn't see the scientists, the basic scientists out there trying to explain why it is that Andrew Wakefield's hypothesis made not a bit of sense at any juncture, And so I actually wrote a book called Bad Advice, or Why Celebrities, Politicians, and Activists Aren't Your Best Source of Health Information, which is kind of my innocence abroad for trying to get on the media. Because what you have to learn is how to communicate in the media. And it is the opposite of what you're trained to do as a scientist. As a scientist, you are trained. An excellent scientist is one who never goes beyond their data. That your discussion section is full of caveats, right? Here's what limits my data. This, and this limits my data. Then you are ground as an excellent scientist. It's the opposite in the real world. You have to be willing to go on national TV and say MMR vaccine doesn't cause autism, even though you can't say that. You can only say that MMR has not been associated with autism at a certain level of statistical power. That's all you can say. You can never prove never. You can only say that you can reject the null hypothesis. You cannot reject the null hypothesis. You can never accept the null hypothesis. You can't ever prove never. So you know that as a scientist. So you have to be willing to set that aside, be willing to be struck dead by the gods of the scientific method, and get out there and say MMR vaccine doesn't cause autism. And that's just one of many things you have to learn to do. And when you're on TV, where you have about 4 minutes tops to explain a difficult concept, you have to learn how to do that. And the way you learn how to do that is by doing it. But I think it's really important to do that. I think it's really important for this band of scientists to get out there and get into the game, because you think other people are doing it and they're not. And you get better at it. There's a lot of trips and falls, but I think I'm going to be on CNN about 4 times this week because I think I've gotten better at it. although I still screw up occasionally and make an ass of myself. And you also have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to make an ass of yourself and still, get up the next morning.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I think our next question is from Mr. Vincent Goodwin. He's still here.
Hey, thank you. So you mentioned earlier how about, you sort of think that truth will prevail given enough time, and, the data will speak for itself eventually. And you also talked about how a lot of the anti-vax rhetoric likes to prey on fear. And I guess I want to ask you is, I personally think it's easy to forget that probably the bulk of anti-vaccination individuals are acting in good faith. Like they're trying to do what is best for, say, their child, even if they're, acting on, false assumptions and bad data. I guess my question is, how big a role do you think there is in working on developing trust and, trust with these people, rather than sort of presenting more data that they're just going to discredit because it's all fake news and big pharma and whatever? And whether you know any initiatives that are engaged with this kind of aspect of dealing with the problem.
No, as I said earlier, I do think probably 85% of people who are hesitant about getting vaccines are just scared, and that's okay. But they can't be conspiracy theorists. I mean, they can't believe that the pharmaceutical companies control everything. They control the government. They control the medical establishment. Because if that's the kind of person you're dealing with, I don't see that person as benign. I don't. And first of all, there is no convincing them. So I do think that as a general rule, parents do try and act in the best interest of their children until they don't. And when they don't, it's because they have bought into this conspiracy theory notion. And I don't think that's okay. I mean, this is why I think I probably get the amount of hate mail that I get, the occasional death threat and physical harassment, is I don't think that's your right. I don't think it's your right as a parent to put your child in harm's way unnecessarily. I don't. And so that's why I support things like vaccine mandates, because although parents generally are considered by the sort of the legal, sort of the jurisprudence notion in this country that parents are always acting in the best interest of their children, that's true until it's not. And when it's not, do you stand back and let it happen? That's the question. And I think, so I'm a little less accepting, I guess, of the parents who stand back and say, look, this is all conspiracy. I know that. I know you're part of the conspiracy. I don't want to hear from you. I'm going to protect my child from the evil pharmaceutical world and not get them vaccinated. I don't have a lot of, also, I think after my third death threat, I think I got a lot less sympathetic for the anti-vaccine activists.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
A bad sport is what I'm saying, Vincent.
I believe our next question is from Rebecca.
Hi, I had a question about the COVID vaccine. You mentioned earlier that African Americans are highly unlikely, or are much less likely to receive the COVID vaccine. Yet there's evidence to suggest that they're at higher risk of worse outcomes from COVID. So I was wondering if you had any theories as to why arguably one of the most vulnerable groups are the most hesitant to receive the vaccine.
Well, I think we have earned the distrust of African Americans in our healthcare system. I do. I mean, I think that they have generally been underserved. Certainly, there's these awful instances like the Tuskegee experiments, and others. The immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, that sort of story. I mean, it's so. The African Americans as a group tend to be more distrustful. They're less likely, for example, to be organ donors because they believe that if you list yourself as an organ donor, that the doctors won't take care of you as much and stuff, and will be more likely to let you die. I mean, I don't know if you can see I have a sort of scar over my right eye here from what it was a couple weeks ago. I fell and had this like 12-stitch gash over my right eye. So I went to the local emergency department here, the Cape May Regional Medical Center. Don't recommend it, but so in any case, the nurses were there, and they were one by one. The nurses were going to get their vaccine, their mRNA vaccine, and there was an African American phlebotomist that came to sort of collect my blood. I said, are you going to be getting your vaccine too? And he said, no, I'm not going to get the vaccine that they give to Black people. I said, do you think there's two separate vaccine batches, like one for Black people, one for white people? Yes. That's what, there was no talking him out of it. I mean, I said, I'm actually on the FDA's vaccine advisory committee. That's not true. But he would just not believe it. And so I think what we have to do, because you're right, I mean, it breaks my heart. If you have to pick a group that's more likely to suffer from, more likely to die from this virus, it's an African-American group. They're the ones who especially benefit from this vaccine. So there are massive efforts in this country to try and figure out who are the influencers in that community and to get them out there to influence. There's a group, there's probably the oldest medical association in the United States. It's called the National Medical Association. It is a group of African-American physicians. And so they especially have now trying to get out there into the communities to make that case, as are sort of people in the clergy and religious communities, to try and influence those groups. I think that's right. I mean, I had to give a talk actually to a group of African-American nurses in our hospital, and I sort of went through why it is that I think you consider vaccines to be safe. And they were saying that we need to get out of the community and give that message, but it was clear they didn't want me to give that message. They didn't think I would be influential. Fair enough.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Eleanor.
Hello. So this is kind of further to your point about how essentially scientists need to become better communicators and need to be more willing to communicate. I find it really interesting because I part of my degree is in science communication, and the idea that scientists need to communicate better goes all the way back to the Enlightenment. And Charles Babbage said that scientists need to be prepared to communicate better to the public. And I think it's really easy to kind of blame people for not being educated enough about science, and it's people are being stupid and they're believing conspiracy theories. And as you've quite rightly identified, scientists need to kind of become better at communicating. We've had the same revelation was had in the UK, and I think the 80s with the Save British Science initiative that concluded absolutely people don't need to know enough about science, and it's up to scientists to make them learn that. So why is it, do you think, that considering we've had this idea for over 200 years that scientists have to be responsible for educating people about science, why do you think is it that still we are in this position where scientists are not as good at communicating that they should be, and they're here in 2021, you're telling us that us as a new generation of scientists, we need to be out at communicating? Why do you think we haven't got there yet?
I think it's important for us to do it because I think we understand science the best. Mm-hmm. And so the problem is it is a complete clash of cultures. I mean, as a scientist, you are considered to be good as a scientist, or as scientists, what we try and do is we try and reduce uncertainty by explanation. So we try and explain things fully to try and because we feel that is the best way to communicate information. That's the opposite of what you need to do when you often talk to radio or magazines or newspapers, especially television. I mean, television, you got 4 or 5 minutes to reduce very complex issues into a soundbite. It feels intellectually dishonest. In some ways, it is intellectually dishonest. I mean, it's a completely different skill set. That said, it's a skill set you need to learn. I mean, I think one of the reasons that I've been asked more and more to be on CNN in the last couple months is that I think I've gotten better at explaining the science of these vaccines simply, and that's because I watch other scientists tend to kind of drift into jargon, because it's how we communicate. And others dumb it down so much so that it's becomes useless. But I just think it's an acquired skill, because you're not getting that skill from being a scientist. You're getting that skill from the way you develop any skill, which is trial and error. You just get on there and I mean, this book I wrote called Bad Advice basically is my sort of mea culpa of all the mistakes I've made trying to learn how to communicate science to the media. One after the next after the next. It was really cathartic to write that book. I don't know if anybody's read it, but if anybody in the world has read that book, but it was fun to write.
Thank you. If I can add a quick sort of part two, if that's okay. I agree with you entirely that there is this cultural disconnect in science between expertise and accessibility. What do you think is it that has to change about science culture that makes us communicate better? I mean, is it that does this need to happen this needs to be sort of instilled in us young, that at an undergraduate level we're being impressed upon us the importance of communication? How do you think we train scientists from the offset to communicate better?
I think, I was funded by the National Institutes of Health for 26 years to do the basic science research I did. So who paid my salary? I mean, it was really the government that paid my salary.
Mm.
The taxpayer paid my salary. I think it is therefore my responsibility to learn how to communicate what I do to the public. Because if I don't learn how to do that, then the public might just turn around and say, you know what, I don't think it's all that important to fund science. Why don't we cut back on that? And so I think that it should be required at some level that when you receive federal money to do your work, that you also have to take a course or courses in how to communicate what you do to the public, and that you're required at some level to communicate what you do to the public. I mean, I created the bovine humans with my coworkers, created the bovine humans reassorted strains that became RotaTeq, the vaccine RotaTeq. And it was a massive effort, 26-year effort. But during that time, I should have been communicating how it was happening, you know, how we did it, what you could expect. I mean, so I think that would help. I think you should be required to do it at some level. And you should certainly be required to be educated on how to do it, because it is a skill that's contrary to everything else you're basically learning about how to communicate to your fellow scientists.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for making it 2 questions.
Oh, that's wonderful. I have a little question, which I think I know the answer to, but I wonder, as a member of the FDA Vaccine Advisory Board, I wonder if you could shed a light on how resistant, how robust do you think the drug approval process in the FDA is to political pressure, to pressure from above, from the government, from the public? Do you think that it's highly? I would imagine so.
It is certainly susceptible to pressure. I mean, you could see that in the past on things having to do with sort of like birth control devices, et cetera, you know, morning after pills. The Trump administration was uniquely bad at this. I mean, they certainly bent the FDA to its will. I mean, the sort of, you know, approving of hydroxychloroquine under emergency use authorization was a joke. There was no evidence that it worked. There very quickly was evidence that it didn't work and that it was unsafe for the treatment of, you know, COVID-19. So that was an example of that. But I think see the thing, right? But I think in general it's not. I think in general the FDA stands between the pharmaceutical companies and the American public to protect the American public. I mean, I've had a much closer look at that now that I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. But it was tricky under the Trump administration. It was. I mean, the Donald Trump wanted a vaccine before November 3rd. He wanted a vaccine before the election. And there was a lot of pressure to do that. And finally, Stephen Hahn, who's the FDA commissioner, stood up and said, we have to have 2 months of safety data after the second dose, which is the right thing to do. That's what we do for every other vaccine, including pediatric vaccines. And when he said that we had to do that, that pushed the vaccine to after November 3rd. He wanted to fire Stephen Hahn when Hahn said that. But so there was a lot of pressure. But you know, the Trump administration, I really do think was unique in that. He just was, you know, just a terrible president and a terrible person. I am so fucking glad he's gone. So.
Uniquely terrible indeed. I believe our next question is from Marshall. If you hear Marshall.
Hello. It's, I suppose, a question that I don't think we can have a factual answer on, so it's more of an opinion question. I was just wondering if, as a communicator, you feel, especially as someone that is being heard more often than, well, a scientist that's, well, just a different scientist, if you feel like, for example, you have an obligation as a science communicator to remain particularly calm while debating something, and perhaps people coming at you quite strong, so that you don't harm the cause, so to speak?
I think you have to appear reasoned, but I do think it's perfectly fine to be emotional on certain issues. I mean, I think that, for example, I think tomorrow morning I'm on New Day, which is a CNN program with John Berman and Alison Camerata. I mean, I think they're going to ask me about this thing about the anti-vaccine people sort of stopping people getting vaccines at Dodger Stadium in LA. I think I will be a little emotional there to show how dangerous I think that is, how how this group talks about how people need to make choices, yet they were making a choice for those people by not letting them get vaccinated. I mean, it's okay to be pointed, direct, a little emotional. I think that's okay. It's because you're human. It's okay to appear human. I think to appear solely as detached and reasoned, people need to be able to identify with you, and people are emotional.
Thank you very much for your question. Wonderful. I believe next we have Mr. Lewis again.
Hiya, thanks. Thanks very much. I mean, I noticed you said, you know, and I guess I'm not informed enough to make a proper opinion, but I'd hesitantly agree that you would support mandated vaccination. And I just wondered, do you think that a more heavily mandated medical action in general might provoke a more visceral and maybe even violent response from, well, perhaps even a more broad right-wing base? I mean, since it's a mandated government action, it's perhaps something that might appeal to, a broader base there. But especially especially more far-right members who, as you said earlier, might become more entrenched by provocation, and therefore perhaps more vocal. So do you think maybe that may cause more harm?
Yes, and that's always the argument that's made. In fact, when I think for the British Medical Journal, I had to write a pro-mandate, and I think David Salisbury actually took the anti-mandate stance. But and the arguments that he made, well, at least one of the arguments he made was the argument you just made, that all you're going to do is push people further and further into an emotional sort of response. But here's what I would say. I think in this country, there were only, let's say 10 years ago, there were only 2 states that had so we mandate, every state has vaccine mandates at some level. But there's a pop-off valve, which is either religious exemptions or philosophical exemptions. It's very easy to get a religious exemption, just sign your name. And the same thing with philosophical exemptions in most states. It's very easy not to get out of the mandate. There were only 2 states, Mississippi and West Virginia, were the only, which is not 2 you would necessarily pick, that didn't have either a religious or philosophical exemptions. Then the outbreak started. When Andrew Wakefield and his MMR causes autism theory came to the United States, you started to see outbreaks of measles, even though we'd eliminated measles by the year 2000. This British import actually caused us to have measles outbreaks. Sorry. And so you started to see states fighting back. New York, California, and a third state. So now there's 5 states now that have, and Maine. So New York, California, and Maine basically all eliminated religious and philosophical exemptions. There's now 5 states that have only mandates. There are no philosophical or religious exemptions. If you want to get out of vaccinating your child, then you're going to have to homeschool them, which is emotionally burdensome, physically, and physically burdensome, and financially burdensome. So you're right. I think there has been more anger in those states, especially California, because of that. But the fact of the matter is, immunization rates went up in every one of those states once they eliminated these pop-off valves, these exemptions to mandates. You know, it's like there's this awful quote that was on Richard Nixon's desk right around the time he was being impeached. It was something like, once you've got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. That's sort of what this is. I mean, you basically take the choice away, and that's what's happened. And if the goal is to get more children immunized so that they're not likely to suffer measles and be in the intensive care unit with measles or die from measles, this does work. But you're right. Does it create greater anger? Yes. Violence even. I mean, Richard Pan, who was a Democratic state senator in Sacramento, who pushed that, the elimination of the philosophical exemption in California, thus leaving them with no exemptions. You know, he was physically harassed. People threw blood on him. I mean, it was bad. He had to get a bodyguard. He certainly provoked anger. But on the other hand, immunization rates in California dramatically increased when that happened.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If it's okay with you, Dr. Offit, we'll have 3 more questions. That's all right?
Okay.
Cool. So the first of those questions comes from, let me try and remember. Carissa.
Yeah, hi. My question is more like COVID-19 related. And it's more of like my observation on, different vaccines being invented or found by many different countries. And I was wondering on your opinions on like political propaganda behind, what kind of vaccines should a certain country or people in that country use and choose, and how it influences on the anti-vaccine culture.
No, that's a really good question. There is a certain nationalism to the vaccine rollout for COVID-19, isn't there? I mean, in England, you have approval of the AstraZeneca vaccine with data, Frank, to be perfectly honest, we would never approve a vaccine for here. And that's why the AstraZeneca group is now doing a trial in the US, where it's, I mean, the way that trial played out, just to pick on UK initially, but I'll get to the other countries. The way that trial played out was that, you got sort of, it was done UK, Brazil, right? Half dose, full dose versus full dose, full dose. Those were two different strategies in two different countries. One, dosing interval was a month later, another dosing interval was up to 3 months later. There were different placebo groups. And then they tried to combine those two very different strategies, even different dosing protocols, and say, okay, we have 70% efficacy when you combine the two. And it doesn't work that way. I mean, you have to do a trial that is sensible. If you're going to try and figure out dosing, do that at phase 1. You don't have to do it at phase 3. So I think we would, in the US, we would looked at the UK approval of that AstraZeneca vaccine and thought we would never do that here. So and yet that because that was a UK vaccine, I really think that's how it was played out. This guy who's the head of the University of Oxford group, the Jenner Institute group, I forget, Austin Davis or something. I mean, if you listen to him talk, he is like a combination between a scientist and a game show host. I mean, you feel like you're being sold something every time he speaks. It's not fun. So that's the UK. So there is a nationalism to this. I think it's the same thing in the US. I mean, Moderna's vaccine is a US vaccine. That work was done by the NIH. They're the ones that created the mRNA construct. And that's every time Tony Fauci who you probably know of, I mean, every time he gets on the airwaves and he would talk about mRNA vaccines, initially he would always talk about the Moderna vaccine, even though Pfizer also had an mRNA vaccine. It just wasn't an NIH vaccine. You have Russia that just today came out with a paper in The Lancet. I don't know if you saw it, with their Sputnik 5 vaccine. Finally, we can see phase 3 data. But, Vladimir Putin in August got up and said, this vaccine really works. We've checked all the boxes, even though they'd only finished a phase 1 trial. You have China with their Sinovac vaccine, their inactivated vaccine, which is given to hundreds of thousands of people in China. It's been sent to places like Venezuela, and they've still never published a phase 3 study. There is a real nationalism to this. I get it, and you can see how people would be distrustful of that. I agree.
Thank you very much, Lisa. The first of our last two questions, couldn't find the unmute button for a second there. It's from Inigo Howe.
Hi, yeah, so it seems like we're maybe beyond peak Wakefield, but there does seem to be quite a stubborn group of anti-vaxxers. And I was sort of wondering, what things do you think science communicators about vaccines got wrong that they could have done that would have led to that group maybe being slightly easier to convert, or just a smaller group in general?
I think the anti-vaccine movement was born after the first vaccine. I mean, if you look at the Jenner's smallpox vaccine, there's that James Gilray cartoon from 1802 where, a disinterested Edward Jenner is inoculating people with the smallpox vaccine, while you look at everybody around him are starting to take on bovine characteristics, right? Sort of floppy ears, snouts, tails, little cows growing out of their butt. I mean, that was like the internet 1802. That's the way I see that. And if you ask people back then, what do they want? The answer to that question is the same thing if you ask anti-vaccine activists here today. What do you want? What's going to stop you from doing this? And they all have the same answer. Don't mandate vaccines. Make it optional. Make it optional and we're all good. And the problem with that is that when you choose not to vaccinate yourself or your child, you're not only making a decision for yourself, you're also making a decision with those with whom you come in contact. Do you have any sort of societal obligation? Yes, you do. And that people choose not to do that is it's just viewed, I think, correctly as not their choice. So I think this was inevitable. I mean, we're asking people to inject themselves or their children with a biological agent, and that feels wrong. And you can see how people would say, look, I don't want to do that, and I'm going to use this awful information as a way to say I shouldn't do that. And that's the thing that bugs me the most about the anti-vaccine people, or that I like about the anti-vaccine people, is they're never right. Honestly, it's remarkable how consistently wrong there are. I mean, there's a lot of problems with vaccines. I can list for you the oral polio vaccine. It was a rare cause of polio. The influenza vaccine is a rare cause of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is not trivial. There was a squalene adjuvanted flu vaccine that was given in Europe that was a rare cause of narcolepsy, a permanent disorder of wakefulness. The yellow fever vaccine is a very rare cause of something called viscerotropic disease, which is like a form of yellow fever that can be fatal. I mean, all the things I just mentioned to you could be, or potentially are permanently harmful. And you never hear about that. You never hear about that from the anti-vaccine people. It's all autism, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, hyperactivity disorder. They're never right. That's why when they sort of seized on Bell's palsy as being a consequence of the mRNA vaccines, I breathed a sigh of relief, because they're never right. And as it turns out now, post-approval, it looks like it's the same as the background rate. So,
very much. Our next question is from Mr. Neil Cutland.
Oh, hello. Yeah, thanks. Good evening. Hello, Paul. There's lots of reasons why people might not want to get a vaccine. I agree with you that I think the hardcore anti-vaxxers are probably quite small in number, and that the vaccine hesitant, the people who just aren't sure or scared, are a far more significant problem. And I think possibly even, like, knowing my experience of the way our government tends to handle things, the availability, supply of vaccine might be more of a problem to us than vaccine deniers or hesitants, However, that aside, my concern at the moment is that all the messaging that's coming out of our government is have the vaccine, we've got it rolling out, we want you to have it. However, we don't know much yet. So when you do get it, still self-isolate, still stay socially distanced, still wear a mask, still don't go out, still lock down, blah, blah, blah. And my concern is that people ultimately will start saying, well, what's in it for me to have the vaccine then, given that I'm slightly nervous anyway? If all of those things are still going to apply to me, do you think there is some concept of the sort of vaccine passport or some messaging that needs to come out from our government and others to convince people to have it, despite these ongoing restrictions they'll be subject to?
So I certainly don't like the idea of a vaccine passport. First of all, it assumes the vaccine is 100% effective, which isn't true. I mean, even the mRNA vaccines are 95% effective. You may be one of those 1 in 20 people who, in fact, is vulnerable to that virus, even though you have a passport. So I don't like that idea. I think right now, I'm going to sound a note of optimism here. I think things are about to get better. I do, for these reasons. At least I'll use our country as an example. Although I should preface this by saying I'm a Philadelphia Eagles season ticket holder, and every year I think we're going to win the Super Bowl, just to give you some just perspective on this. But you have, in the US, we have 2 vaccines that are very effective. We have 2 more vaccines, the UK vaccine and the J&J vaccine. They're probably going to come online soon. You have about 30 million doses of the vaccine have already been distributed, at least first doses. And I think you definitely need 2 doses. It's a 2-dose vaccine, just like the UK vaccine is a 2-dose vaccine. And this whole notion of delaying that second dose for months is a mistake. You need to get that second dose, because that's when you get immunological memory. That's when you get much higher titered responses. And also, I think when you have a lower titered response with that first dose, all you're going to do is increase the risk of selecting variants. So I think 2-dose vaccine. We list in this country as having 26 million people who've already been infected, but that's really just 26 million people who have tested and been found to be infected. If you look at the number of people who've really been infected in this country by doing antibody surveillance studies, you find that figures off by at least a factor of 3. It's probably closer to between 75 and 100 million people, as many as 100 million people in this country have already been infected, which is to say they're largely immune, at least against severe disease they are. So you're at 20, 25, even maybe as many 30% of people who already are essentially vaccinated. And you're now giving vaccine, and it's about to get warmer out. And we have an administration that has a clue. So I think things will gradually get better. And when that happens, when you start to see a diminution in cases and hospitalizations and deaths, then I think people are going to feel a lot better about this and about being vaccinated and about going outside and stuff. I think that it's just, and I'm not sure when you get to that number. I mean, it's because it's not going to get to 0. I think there's going to be that number we get to where just gradually people feel better. It's what's interesting to me is that every year in this country, 150 to 200 children die of flu every year. Okay, this year, 1 child has died of flu. 1. It's already February. The reason for that is we're masking and social distancing, and that's also affected immunization or rates of flu disease. It's interesting, and so therefore you can conclude when this is all over and the dust settles, and we're going to see that the flu rates were down to negligible what they had been. You can reasonably conclude, why don't we wear masks and social distance some level every winter? And then we'll decrease the roughly 60,000 deaths we have from flu every year and 700,000 hospitalizations. That's not going to happen. It's not, because we've accepted that for flu. We've said that's okay. I mean, arguably, when I go to Philadelphia Eagles games in the winter, I should wear a mask, except it's hard to boo through a mask. That's one of the problems with wearing a mask. But so, I mean, it's sort of like what we accept, I think. Flu, people see flu as benign, even though it's far from benign. And also interesting, the flu vaccine efficacy is about 50 to 60%. It's not all that amazing, but we do get flu vaccine.
Thanks very much.
Sure.
Thank you. I'm aware that you probably need to be going soon. We do have one more question from someone in the chat. Would you like to answer?
Yeah, sure.
Of course. Okay then. Samuel Lloyd, please go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you very much for giving your views. It's been really interesting. One thing that I find really strange about anti-vaccine kind of views is that, I mean, whenever I speak to people who are like anti-vax, they kind of reference it like doctors or people with like impressive credentials, and they say, oh, this person thinks, they're like really high regarded, they're like well published, they've done, they're eminent scientists supposedly, and that's why I listen to their views. But then you try and speak to them and say, well, like, what about the majority of the scientific community who stands with vaccines? And then they kind of, it's almost like there's a disconnect, but they're still using, like, they're like selecting experts. So on the one hand, they're like trusting science, like selectively, but then on the other hand, they're completely rejecting swathes of it. So how do you kind of combat that and almost like help people see that, like, kind of, just bring those views together, if you know what I mean?
No, it's hard. I mean, Andrew Wakefield actually did interesting and important work regarding sort of the vasculitis and inflammatory bowel disease. He's a smart guy. I mean, he had done good work. He was at the Royal Free Hospital, which is a prestigious hospital as far as I can tell. I mean, and then he sort of went off the deep end. I mean, Linus Pauling won 2 Nobel Prizes. That's not easy. And then he came to the belief that vitamin C treated not only the common cold, but cancer and virtually everything that ails you. And he never went off that notion. I mean, suddenly this person who was such a brilliant scientist was unwilling to look at data anymore. And so not only can you find people with credentials, you can find people who have really good credentials who are willing to go again. And so the person, Luc Montagnier, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering HIV as the cause of AIDS, then became a believer that that you could treat autism with antibiotics, and founded an institute essentially that promoted that. I mean, these were brilliant people, not just good people who then hung on to these crazy notions. So it's hard. It's hard to get people to understand that there is this notion of scientific consensus, that the truths emerge over time, and that you should listen to those truths. It's hard. I agree with you, because you're always going to have those people who are not only credentialed, but sometimes remarkably so, who are on the other side.
Do you think, sorry, just quickly, do you think then that, like anti-vaxxers just kind of will just pick and choose regardless and say, oh, this person will, thinks this, so that's great. And it doesn't matter who it is, they'll just pick and choose whichever scientist they want to like.
There's 400, at least pre-COVID, There were roughly 4,000 articles published in medical and scientific journals every day that follow, as you would imagine, a bell-shaped curve. Some are excellent, some are awful, most are more or less mediocre. But you can find anything you want to find supporting a notion that you have in a published literature, and you can then pull it out and say, "See, scientific publication. This shows that HPV vaccine causes primary ovarian failure, even though it doesn't." You're always up against that. You're right. The anti-vaxxers will use science against us because, you know, science is a human endeavor. Humans are flawed. There's going to be a lot of bad publications out there. That just has to be true. All right, guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Offit. Is there anything you'd like to shout out to the people here today? Your books, for example, or your Twitter? I don't know if you're active.
I'm terrible at that, promoting my books, but here's what I would say. Just there, you do have an obligation. I think you have an obligation as a scientist to communicate what you do. I do, and don't be scared. I mean, the more the merrier. We need people out there communicating science, and the best people to do it are the people who understand it the best. You just have to figure out how to translate it.
Thank you very much.
Sure, good luck.
And go Eagles.
Go Eagles. All right.
Thank you very much, everyone. Do check in on our Facebook page. We'll be hosting more events like this soon. And if anyone's interested in contributing to our blog, do have a look at the message in the chat. Thank you very much.